you doing, babe?
Good. How are you doing?
Is this weird?
Yeah, a little bit. We just transformed our living room into the studio, so.
Yeah, this is weird. You're a tough get, Hilary Matheson.
I know, I have a busy schedule. It's hard to pin me down.
Yeah.
Got to really track me down.
You're in high demand these days. So you are a photographer, videographer, a media director, graphic designer, and now a budding YouTuber.
And I run sometimes, but you know.
Yeah, and an athlete too. But in the creative space, you wear a lot of different hats. What do you seem to be identifying with the most these days? Like, what is really capturing your interest and your, like, what are you most passionate about?
It's a tough question, honestly. Like when people ask me, like, what do you do? I used to just automatically say, oh, photographer. That's where I started in the ultrarunning world. And it's my first passion. But I feel like, yeah, I wear so many different hats now. It's kind of hard to answer. I think I'll take anything except for YouTube influencer. So sorry. I don't know. I think right now I'd say maybe just, I don't know, content creator, but that seems kind of vague. I like wearing lots of hats, honestly. Like I like not being able to pin down exactly what I do. It's kind of fun. Like a lot of the work I'm doing right now is helping run the media team for Destination Trails 200 milers. And so that's like this whole other hat I put on where I'm not shooting at all, but I'm managing all this creative content and I'm really enjoying that.
Yeah, literally as we speak,
yeah.
There's a 200-mile race going on.
Yeah,
right
there's
now.
a YouTube live stream of the finish line behind you that I'm running remotely in the background. So I'm learning a lot about the technology side of doing these events. I love mentoring. So actually, I think that's the most rewarding thing I've done in the last couple of years is bringing in new photographers into the space, especially other female photographers, and helping grow the sport. I'm a huge believer in the fact that if we want to have good storytelling, you have to have diversity in who's telling those stories and perspectives. So to me, like just helping being part of that and kind of putting my money where my mouth is, like, I don't know, I find that really satisfying. So from a career perspective, it's interesting because I feel like it's more behind the scenes. But, you know, at the same time, I'm kind of seeing this whole other side of ultra running and I love it.
Yeah, there's an obvious dearth of female creatives in particular in the ultra running space. And I don't know, like, why do you think that is?
It's a good question. And honestly, it's why I got into shooting photography in the first place. Like kind of my origin story there was I was just out running ultras and with a lot of male photographers. And, you know, we'd go out and I'd notice like there's just not a lot of women shooting. I worked on a couple projects where we tried to find female photographers, like taking trail running photos, and we actually couldn't find anyone to be part of it. And it just kind of got me thinking. And I was like, well, what is it? Like, is it the intimidation factor because it's physically hard? You know, like you're schlepping all this gear in to really remote places and you're doing the work as well. So it's hard to be creative and also just like not die, you know? And I think it just kind of inspired me. Like I was already loving ultra running and very involved in that world. And I thought, well, if I can kind of combine these things and I taught myself how to use a camera. I took it on every single run. I used all my friends as guinea pigs. And I just kind of thought, well, I'll just like do this. And, you know, hopefully we'll see other women be inspired and get into it. So, yeah, I don't know why there isn't a lot. I certainly have seen it grown. And it's grown in the last few years, but still, I think it's a tough world. It's physically demanding. Like even ultras, if you look at the percentage of women running ultras, it kind of makes sense that there's not a lot of women on the creative side too. So, yeah. Yeah.
I guess the ratio is kind of proportional to, or maybe even less so, right?
I would say less. Yeah. I would say there's only a handful, you know, like the woman that I'm working with on the Destination Trail stuff. It's like, that's the first time that I've ever worked with other female creatives on trail running projects. So, I mean, it still kind of excites me. It's like, oh, yeah, this is a totally different dynamic. So I think you're seeing it change. And I think more race directors are starting to appreciate that they want to also include more women on the creative side or behind the scenes. But like everything, it just takes time, you know?
Well, let's jump back a few steps. When exactly did you decide to jump into the creative world? And I know these are a lot of these questions I already know the answer to, obviously, because, and we'll get into the reasons why. But yeah, I'm sure there are some stories that I've missed out on. So I am really fascinated and curious about your journey into the creative world. So let's take a few steps back and talk about when you decided to enter in the foray of being the lucrative world of creative in the ultrarunning space? Because you did come from a more of a traditional 9 to 5 type corporate job.
Yeah, I mean, I started running ultras 10 years ago, I guess. I kind of jumped into it. And so the creative side sprang from that. I think I started shooting maybe 7 years ago. And again, it was just born from this desire to capture like where I was and recognizing that there wasn't a lot of female photographers. I didn't really go into it thinking I was going to make a career out of it. You know, I could see that it wasn't that lucrative even at the time. And I did have a 9 to 5. I worked a corporate job. I worked in communications for the government up in British Columbia, where I'm from, very 9 to 5. And I just started taking photos, and then brands started reaching out to me, and they were specifically looking for female photographers, or they liked what I was shooting. And it just kind of like piqued this little interest where I was like, oh, interesting. I got invited to go on a few cool trips. I went to the UK and did this like fell running trip. And I went to Death Valley and I shot this like fun trip there with Under Armour. And it just kind of started making me think like, oh, maybe there's an opportunity to grow this and make it something bigger. And I found I was using like all my vacation time to go on these cool trips, you know, like trying to maximize all that. And eventually I just got to the point where I was like, you know, I think I need to go for it. And make
how long was that going on where you had each foot dipped into the corporate side and the creative side?
Probably a couple years where it just kind of grew. And it was like a very small part of my life. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh yeah, and I have to go to work, you know? And I just, got to the point where I was using all my free time doing this other thing that I loved so much more. I had a couple things happen in life that just reminded me of how quickly things can change. Lost someone, you know, that was fairly close to me, and just kind of had that moment of like, you know, if I'm spending all my time somewhere that I'm not really happy, and I'm, you know, cramming everything else into this small part of my life, then I think I have the ratio backwards. So, was
that your ex-boyfriend's brother that passed away that you're referencing?
Yeah. So Chili Tom, he was a really well-known artist, and he had a very quick and sudden battle with cancer. And I helped work on his kind of legacy portfolio of artwork and spent a lot of time with him talking about how, you know, he wanted his work to be perceived after he was gone. And it just really hit me like, you know, we have such a short window of time that we're here, and he had so much more that he wanted to say and do as an artist that he was just getting started. Like he was, you know, there was talk of him being nominated for this like huge award in Canada right as he passed. Like all these things were kind of happening in his life, and it just wasn't fair. And I just had this moment as I was kind of going through that whole year of working with him on all of his work and his life's work. And I just thought, wow, like it really is so short. It really has gone like that. And that was kind of what made me quit my job. And then I went back to school for a year, actually, which was an interesting decision. Like, I think it would have been really easy for me to just go and dive into the photography world. And I had enough work and I had some clients, and I probably could have, you know, scrambled along and eked something out. But I wanted to be able to build something and to have a little bit more security. So I went back to school and I went into graphic design. And that's kind of been an interesting part of my journey since then, because I've been able to combine a lot more, you know, on the like technical side and things that I never would have been able to do if I just kind of was a self-taught photographer. So it's opened up doors.
Yeah, this is the kind of work that makes your mom sleep a little better at night and worrying about you, that it's a little more pragmatic and a little more, I don't know, maybe consistent.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I've been involved in so many things. I've been published in some international books and had some really cool opportunities come up. 'Cause I'm also a writer, and I wear so many different hats, I think, that are just all in line with the things I'm interested in. But I think if you still ask my parents, like, what does Hilary do? My dad would be like, I don't know. She somehow pays her bills. I don't know how. I told her she shouldn't have quit her job. So, you know, they don't quite get it, but they do appreciate kind of how much I love my life and how much I've gotten from it. So.
Was there a moment that you can point back to where you decided, okay, this was a gig that's kind of, allowing me to realize that this can be a lifestyle, that this can be a career path? Was there one particular gig that comes to mind for you?
Honestly, no, because none of them paid me very much money. So there was never a moment where I was like, oh, I'm actually making enough money that this makes sense. I think it was just realizing that I was happy with what I was doing. When I finished my graphic design program, I hopped on a plane 3 days later and I went to the Himalayas. And I spent like 2 months there climbing all these different peaks in the Everest region and put together a little project with some friends. And I think I was just proud of the fact that I was taking chances. And like, like Hilary from 10 years before that would have never dreamed of going to the Himalayas. Like, I don't come from a family that travels a lot. I grew up on a farm. I was homeschooled, very like small town. And so even the fact that I had the nerve to like get on a plane, go to somewhere so remote. I was the only girl on a team of all guys. We were out there for a couple months, like not showering, all that stuff. I was just like, yeah, like at least I'm pushing myself. At least I feel like I'm living it, So I think it was just experiences like that made me feel like I was going down the right road.
Let's get a little more practical, because I'm sure a lot of people out there watching on YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube or listening to this conversation, have thought about it, whether they're a hobbyist or they're passionate about a certain creative pursuit. What are some of the pros and cons of this lifestyle? I think, a couple of things we brought up, like inconsistency and paycheck, maybe an industry that doesn't pay super well. But there are some really phenomenal things like being able to travel the world and seeing creative, not creative, but really cool, like path less traveled type places in mountains and of the world. So maybe spell it out for people, what you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Oh man. I mean, I honestly feel like I've had so many chapters even in the last 6 years, which is kind of how long I'd say my actual professional career has been as a creative, post-school. Whether it is these big extended trips, like I've been to Africa a couple times, I've been to Nepal twice as well. Just those trips are amazing. They're certainly not the most lucrative. And often I'm kind of reaching out to brands and pitching them and being like, hey, I have this idea. Like, do you want to support me? And how much? And, oh, you'll give me some jackets? Great. Just trying to find the balance of being able to pay for these trips and have these experiences and also still have creative control and be able to tell the stories that I want to tell. So that part is interesting because I think one of the pros to this whole lifestyle is that you get to choose your direction. And then one of the cons is that your direction is often influenced by the money, And I think you probably feel that too. It's just like you want to be able to tell those stories that really like impact you and you're passionate about, but then you also need to pay your bills. And so I have found it's an interesting balancing act, and you're always trying to find brands that will align with what you are interested in and believe in and trying to just stay true to yourself and not sell out too much. But it's definitely challenging. And it's, as rewarding as it is, I still look back on my corporate job and I think, wow, I didn't work that hard for, the paycheck that I got. And that was a really steady paycheck. And so it's just, I don't know that there's a right or wrong way to do this. I sometimes look back at, the 7 years I worked in the corporate world and I think I actually did more adventuring during my weekends because I knew I had like from Friday at 5 p.m. until Monday at 8 a.m. to get all my adventures in. And I really maximized that. And I think that the danger of this lifestyle when you don't really have a boss or a schedule to answer to is that sometimes you can get caught up in projects and you don't maximize that time outside.
Yeah.
Or maybe you view it differently because you're focused on, what content can I create out of it? So that's something that I've had to kind of step back and recognize. And there are a lot more times now that I don't take my camera with me than I do. Whereas I used to take it everywhere with me when I was learning and growing. And I think some of that is just being able to separate like my love of the mountains and what's personal to me from what I share with the world. So it's like constantly this like moving target of what's working and what needs to change. And I think I find that fascinating because I'm never bored with where I am,
Yeah, but it is a hard distinction to make, right? Like Hilary Matheson, the athlete, Hilary Matheson, the creative, because like, for instance, more recently, you trained and ran a 100-mile race, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I just saw the level of bandwidth when you're consumed by a creative project versus like knowing that you have to get in the time in the mountains to properly train for something. And you are a phenomenal athlete, but it does pull you in opposing directions versus, say, a similar direction because it's just hard to compartmentalize the two. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like, I find it very difficult if I have a 100-mile race or a race that really scares me on the calendar to not have it affect my creative work.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for for High Lonesome 100, which is the race that I just ran recently, I was in Squamish for quite a bit of my training block, and it rained for about 2 months there. And all of these beautiful days in the Alpine that I had in my head that I was going to do as training were out the window because there was so much snow. And so I ended up running loops and loops and loops in the forest in the rain for a month and a half, training for this Alpine race in Colorado. And it was like, you know, I would just force myself out the door half the time, just be like, get the miles in, get the miles in. But it wasn't really a joyful experience. And I think it's just like finding that balance. Like I had a lot of work going on, so I couldn't travel and go find the mountains and have those big epic adventures. And honestly, I didn't have the time to do an 8-hour day in the mountains either. It was like just good enough if I could do an hour and a half or 2 hours and just do it consistently every single day.
Yeah, and the work doesn't stop on weekends. We work all around the clock, and if you're consumed by a project, you are in it.
Totally. And there's times where I'm in a project for 6 weeks and I don't take a day off. And then I have a 2-month period where I can travel and do all these things. And so there's an ebb and flow to it. And I'm a lot better now at kind of, you know, taking advantage of those ebbs and recovering and all that. But when you're in it, like you don't just check out and go play in the mountains all day. It's a lot harder. So yeah, I found training for this race the hardest I've ever found before, like mentally, you know, it just felt like I was just locked into like, just get it done. And I kept saying that a lot more than I have in the past, where I was out just kind of playing and like the training was just a bonus, you know?
The ebb and the flow of this lifestyle, it makes it so that you never do quite get used to it. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm still trying to figure out how much, like what the pie is constantly like in flux and shifting and dynamic. And I just, when people ask me, oh, like, how do you, the work-life balance, how do you make that work? And in my head, regardless of what answer I may give, I never seem to make it fully work optimally. You know what I mean? Can you relate to that?
Oh, for sure. I don't think there's ever a moment where I'm like, the needle is right in the middle. Like, we are perfect. You know, it's like either too much work or I'm wondering where my next paycheck's going to come from and how I'm going to pay my rent. And so neither one is a comfortable feeling, you know? Yeah. And I would love to find that sweet spot in the middle, but I don't know if you do. Like, I don't know if there's anyone out there that's figured it out. I'd love to hear. But I think that is part of the like challenge. And especially for people like us that probably have a fear of being bored above all else, you know, it definitely makes you always on your toes because you don't know what the next day is going to bring. And so you're always kind of looking ahead, but also trying to be present in what you're doing. And yeah, it's a dance for sure.
I often refer to what we do as solopreneurship, you know, and the emphasis on the solo, because it can feel lonely and it can feel isolating when you're working for yourself and you don't have a colleague to lean on or other creatives to sympathize with. I mean, you may, but it's like round the clock, you're always dealing with different things. And so part of the reason, or not part of the reason, but one of the reasons in being able to connect with you on a variety of levels is the creative part is really satisfying and really been rewarding to be able to lean on you and likewise, because we can definitely relate on multiple fronts.
Yeah, and even just getting feedback. And sometimes it's like not the feedback we want to hear, but it's the feedback we need to hear.
Yeah.
You know? And it's like, it's hard when you don't have that. Like if you're in a traditional office environment, you've got 10 colleagues you can bounce stuff off of. And if it's a bad idea, it's going to get shelved somewhere along the way before it goes public. And for me, I feel like, especially with my graphic design stuff, I don't know why that feels like immensely personal to put some of that out there. Maybe because I'm not that great an artist, like illustrator wise. And so I feel self-conscious about some of it. It's just like I put it out there and no one else has seen it. So until I get public feedback, I don't have any feedback. And that's kind of scary because, you know, if it goes sideways, it is on a more public level. And, you know, it's vulnerable a little bit because it does feel like a piece of you that you're putting out there. Like I can't help but be personally connected to my work. It's just the nature of what we do and how much we care about it and how much we put into it. So yeah, it hurts a little bit if people don't like it.
Well, it's a pro and a con because because it's so personal, you put so much more of your passion and your heart into something. But yeah, the flip side to that is if you get one, regardless of how many pats on the backs you get for a video or for a photo or graphic design website, you get that one or two. It's just a dagger through the heart. Yeah, because it is so personal, and you can't again, you can't really distinguish or separate the two because you put so much of yourself into it. Yeah. The life of a solopreneur, like I said.
I like that word.
I want to go back to the travel, because a definite pro of what we do is the ability to see the world, certainly in ways that I never thought, I never dreamt imaginable. And, even coming up this weekend or in the next week, we'll be jet setting over to Europe for UTMB week.
That's
and
crazy.
so, and you're going to see Chamonix for the first time, which is super exciting for me to be able to be right there when you get the reaction of seeing the French Alps for the first time. But some of the places you went to are very off the beaten path, like a place that's not a Hawaii or Fiji Islands or the Bahamas. You went to places, like you said, the Himalayas, Kenya, even parts of Thailand, which we went to last year. I'm really fascinated for you to give me some of your takeaways on maybe some of the mountains you saw, and maybe even more importantly, the people and the culture that you came across, and your lessons and takeaways from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like I said, I didn't do a lot of traveling when I was younger. Like, I think the first time I was ever on a plane was when I was 19. And I actually went skydiving. So I like to say for a while that I'd never landed in a plane. I'd only taken off in one. That was my party trick. But yeah, once I got the travel bug, for sure, it was like game on. And that's kind of why I think that trip to Nepal was so pivotal for me. Is it wasn't just about the big mountains. I think it was the first time where I really interacted with people in smaller towns, people that obviously knew I was a tourist immediately, and we didn't have like a common language or anything, but we found ways to connect.
No one confused you for being a fellow Nepalese?
No one confused me, Shocker. I did have my namaste down, though, by the second day. Yeah. But yeah, just people were so welcoming, and it's in a way that we don't have in North America. And it just struck me over and over again how people would go out of their way for a total stranger. And I got invited to people's homes. I spent, their version of Christmas with a family. I was invited to weddings.
Complete strangers.
Complete strangers.
How were you connected to these people?
So some of that was through one of the friends that I was climbing with. He's Nepalese. He's one of Nepal's top rock climbers. And so that was a really cool way to kind of get to know some of the local athletes. And then I went back there a couple years later, and I connected with some of the friends I'd made, and some like ultrarunning Nepalese. And that just kind of stemmed. And there was actually a point when I was trekking up in the Upper Mustang region in 2018 with my friend Haley, and I realized we were with a group of like 9 Nepalese climbers and athletes and trekkers, and we were the only Westerners. And it was so different than all the other trekking groups up there. And it just was really cool. I was like, wow, like I've actually made community, and I feel like I'm not just kind of showing up here. Like I actually am getting to know people and seeing their love of the mountains and where they grew up. And it's really special. But I think the thing that has stood out to me is just how generous people are. And it doesn't matter how much you have in life. It's that generosity of spirit, and it's giving of what you have. And it's just something that we don't have enough of in North America, especially. And we tie so much to our material possessions. And as cliched as it sounds, when you go somewhere where people don't have as much, it really strikes you that they are no less happy for it. And I think that has stuck with me throughout my whole journey, like working for myself. Like I certainly make a lot less money than I used to, and it's been tough sometimes, but I always go back to this, like you don't need to have all that extra. Like you can be happy, you can be content with what you have. Like it really is a mindset. And I think that I've sought out traveling to places where I find that, and I have those reminders, and that's what makes me feel alive, and it gives purpose and meaning to things beyond just like going and lying on a beach somewhere. That's great sometimes. I love that. We did that in Thailand, and it was nice. But I also love like connecting with local children and, challenging them to races that I'll lose every time. And I don't know, I think when you're warm to people, they respond in kind. And I actually think it's spilled over into my creative work, which is interesting because it's kind of shown me that if I'm vulnerable with people and I open up, that they do the same to me. And some of my favorite photos that I've ever taken or favorite moments have been after I've established that relationship. And it's like that comes first, and then comes the creative work or the photo. You don't just get to like swoop in and have this experience. And so it's kind of impacted like how I see that connection. And so much of it stems from just like that human foundation of like connecting on a very basic level, and it's really beautiful. And so I think I have taken that with me and hopefully continue to remember that. But yeah.
Tell me about your experience in Kenya, a continent, I think, or several countries within that continent that I think would not be on the top of everyone's list of travel destinations. And, we hear stories all the time in the Western world of some of the atrocities and maybe some of the corruption. So with that in mind, was there any apprehension in going to somewhere like Kenya or other parts of Africa?
So that was actually the first trip that I did that was like a scary destination for me, mostly because there'd been some terrorist attacks in Nairobi like a month before I went. And I actually was so scared before I left that I made a list of all the passwords to everything that I owned, and I left the list in a drawer so that my family would find it if I didn't come back, which is a little morbid. Yeah. But I was like, I literally got on the plane being like, this is how it ends. But, I was still proud of the fact that I got on the plane,
Well, what made you get on the plane?
I honestly think it was just this feeling of like, don't be afraid. Like you have to do this or you're going to be afraid. And do you really want your life to be defined by fear? And I just kept telling myself like, yeah, you're fucking terrified right now, but it's okay. Like you're still going to get on that plane and then you're going to get there and it's all going to be okay. And it was, and I had an incredible time there. I was with LifeStraw, which was another kind of early project that came out of my photography. And I actually won a photo contest, which is how I was invited on the trip. And went there and we distributed water filters in these super remote villages right on the edge of Uganda. And some of the villages we went to, like we went to all these schools and the kids had never seen a white person before. So I was like this super novelty act. And I'm very white, so I stood out. And my solution for just connecting with the kids was to just take off running like down the soccer field, and they would get it in like 2 seconds, and they would come streaming after me. And I would turn around and I would get my phone out and I'd film these kids just coming roaring towards me. And like, I love those videos. It's just like really sad iPhone 4 videos, but they're just the cutest moments. And things like that just made me realize like I can connect with people on some level wherever I am. And for me, I was like, well, I have running and they run and they're a lot faster than me. So that was really cool. And, we traveled through like all these amazing areas up in the high parts of Africa or of Kenya where the, elite athletes train. And I saw some of them running along the road, just like, sprinting down the road during their training camps, and, made me realize why they're so fast. If you can do that at altitude on a dirt road with, semi trucks roaring by you, then, like the Boston Marathon has got nothing on you. But yeah, that was an incredible trip and kind of an ironic part of it. So we went through the whole thing. We drove across the whole length of Kenya on the way back and went through the Masai Mara, did, the whole like safari thing, all of that, ran around some volcanoes. Nairobi, there's all these like SWAT teams everywhere because there'd been those terrorist attacks and they were doing like the sweeps under the cars. And I remember like getting on the plane when we left Kenya and being like, oh, I made it. And then ironically, I flew through Paris, and like 2 days after I flew through Paris, there was a bombing at the airport there.
Oh, yeah.
And it was so funny because I remember when we landed in Paris, I had this distinct feeling of like safety. And after that experience, it was
like Kenya was safer.
Right. And I think that taught me a lesson. I think I just kind of threw the rule book out after that. That was the last time I ever got on a plane and felt like genuinely afraid of the trip or kind of held on to things that I couldn't control. It was like, I just had this moment. I was like, I cannot control it, any of it, And so I might as well just enjoy the ride and be present, and it'll be a good ride, no matter where it ends.
And let's face it, the news always focuses on the negative, the terrorist attacks, all the negative stuff that happens. And I've had a handful of people reach out to me before traveling to even LA going, I heard about like this happening or gang violence. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure it happens. It happens every day across the world, regardless of where you live. But it's just not something that's obvious in how it affects us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was in Istanbul after they had the riots there, and I was in that area of town staying, and same thing, like my parents were calling me and, like, are you safe? Blah, blah, blah. And it does make you realize that a lot of our media is fear-based. And, I was directly in a lot of these places where all these horrific images are coming out of. And it's not to say that there isn't, like you said, those things happening, but a lot of life is beautiful and wonderful, and you should still experience it. And I don't believe, at least anymore, I don't believe in waiting until everything feels very safe to do it.
Amplify the good. I think more of that needs to be done. Let's talk about Hilary Matheson, the athlete. How in the world did you get involved in this whole craziness that is ultrarunning? I know there's a Gary Robbins tie-in there too, but just talk about your origin story in the sport.
This is my 10th year of running ultras. I got into it. I had a bit of a convoluted journey in my early 20s. I was quite sick for a while and ended up in the hospital for a few months. I ended up diagnosed with celiac disease, but there was this whole process of being super sick and then kind of recovering from that. And I started hiking actually after that. Like I used to run a little bit when I was in high school and university, just like to stay in shape, but nothing really serious. I never played team sports or anything like that. I actually used to get doctor's notes to get out of playing the team sports because I didn't like sweating and going back to class after. So I was pretty good at avoiding it. After I had the whole being sick thing and spent a bunch of time in the hospital, I felt like I wanted to be outside and I wanted to be away from numbers. I didn't want to be around scales. I didn't want to, because I'd lost a bunch of weight and then my body gained it all back again and then some. And I just kind of had this feeling like I wanted to find myself by being outside. So I started hiking a lot. Vancouver has this very famous trail called the Grouse Grind, which is basically 2 vertical miles up. So I did that a lot. And they were advertising this trail race, which started down at the ocean and went all the way up to the top of Grouse Mountain. And I was like, could probably do that. So I signed up for that and I kind of met some other people that were around my speed as I was doing it. And through that, I started getting into the trail running world. And they were training for a 50K race in Vancouver called the Neenacker. And I was like, who would run 50K? That's insane. And I went out and kind of helped crew them. And that was just like the beginning of me being like, oh, people do this. This is really interesting. And then it was kind of funny, in a very like true to form moment, one of them made this like passing comment about, oh, well, you could never run one of those. Like, I don't think you've got it. It's not you, or something like that. And
somebody said that to you?
Someone said that. And I don't know if they were joking or if they were like threatened, or probably not threatened. I was not exactly fast. But I took it very personally and I signed up for the Squamish 50 race like 2 days after that. And it was in 2 weeks from then. And I'd never run farther than 20 kilometers in my life. So I signed up for this 50K race and I showed up with, I did everything wrong. Like I went out and bought insoles the night before the race and I put these like leather insoles in my shoes because I was like, well, maybe I'll get more use out of them if I get the leather ones rather than the sport ones. And anyways, I gave myself these horrible blisters. I didn't eat for the whole race because I didn't know you were supposed to. The whole thing was terrible.
Kind of important.
I think it took me like 9 hours and I think I crawled the last like half of the race. But anyways, I did finish and I did crawl across that finish line. And I remember just thinking, that was interesting. And I didn't hate it as much as I should have for how miserable that was. And it just like that little piece of my brain that was like fascinated by, I guess, suffering and it was just kind of like tweaked. And then, Gary Robbins was the director of that race. And he ended up kind of starting his coaching business shortly after that. And I was one of his first coaching clients. And so that kind of took my running in a different direction. And, thankfully he was able to give me a lot of his hard-earned wisdom. And, I still made a ton of mistakes and did stupid things like run 10 ultras in 10 months after that. And not a good idea. But anyways, eventually we got around to a place of balance and sustainability. And he was an awesome coach. And it was cool because that was right as he was getting into the Barkley Marathons period of his life. And so I got a lot of insight into just how he was dealing with that and the pressure and the questions he was asking himself around what role that played in his life. It was really kind of cool to see that. And so that really helped me grow as a runner.
You mentioned your bout with celiac and trying to figure out things with your body and getting diagnosed, gaining weight, losing weight, the whole bit. I think it's important to unpack that a little bit more because it did set you up to be, I guess, a tough cookie for lack of a better term, just it set you up mentally for having to deal with these crucibles of life. And I think it could only help you become a better ultra runner because so much of ultra running is between the years, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's the problem. Yeah, I did give you the short version of that story, but I got pretty sick before I was diagnosed with celiac disease. There was a period of time, so I was in a car accident, and I guess that kind of triggered a bunch of stuff that had been in my body as a kid. I was always kind of a sickly kid and teenager, but they never figured out why. And then my body just kind of went into overdrive, and I started just dropping weight. They couldn't figure out why. I was admitted into the hospital when I was like 92 pounds, and I'm 5'8", so that's really bad. And, they discovered I had all these perforations in the lining of my stomach. And so they put me on this like total bowel rest for a month where they fed me through a PICC line and I wasn't allowed to eat any food. And
For a month,
yeah. I watched, and I realized in hindsight, this was like very, sadistic, but I watched a lot of cooking shows during that time. I don't know why I had this obsession. Yeah.
Well, maybe it gave you hope, right? Like
it totally
one
did.
day
I was
will
just
have
clinging.
that quiche. Yeah.
And actually it was funny because I do have these moments and memories, like a lot of it's kind of blurred. I think my brain just like passed out for most of that period of time. But I would walk around the hospital, and from the windows of the hospital, you could see down to the streets below. And there's a famous 10K in Vancouver called the Sun Run, and like 50,000 people run it every year. And I remember when it happened and everybody ran by, I could see them go by. And I remember just thinking, man, like, yeah, that's my goal, is I want to be able to run that run. Like, I'm going to get back there. I'm going to be able to run that 10K. And so that was actually the first race that I ran when I got out of the hospital, and gave me shin splints, all the rest of it, because I didn't actually train for it. But it was like a landmark that I remember being like, yeah, that's pretty amazing. I'm going to get back to a place where I'm healthy enough to do that. And then, yeah, after I got out of the hospital, my body went into overdrive, just trying to fix itself. And I went from 92 pounds to 165 pounds in less than a year. And you can just imagine what that does for your body image when you're like 22 years old. It was really tough because I ran into a lot of people that I knew during that time, and you could just see on their faces like their visceral reaction to what you looked like. It taught me a lot about having empathy and compassion for people and not just judging them based on what you think you know about them. And I got really tired of explaining my story to people, so I would often let them just pass their judgments on whatever they thought was going on. And it was just interesting. Yeah, I think it really did give me a different perspective on just like who I was. And that's kind of what I was searching for when I got into trail running, was like, who am I? Like, I'd had to do a medical withdrawal from university. I was a very like type A kind of controlled person up until that point, like straight A student on the honor roll list. And so it took a lot of those like kind of milestones away from me. But then I also started questioning like whether they were really valuable to begin with. And, like it was the first spark that changed my mindset shift, and just like, what do I want to do? And like, what's important to me? And especially since it felt like I had a bit of a second chance, I feel like you're almost lucky if life kind of stops you from just the path that you're on without questioning it, and then pulls you back, and you have this opportunity to go, is this the path I want to be going down? And I worked in the corporate world for a while, and a lot of that was just getting back on my feet. But that question in my mind of like, is this what I want to do with my life? Like, I think that question stuck with me, and it's still like a huge part of like why I run, especially for the first few years when I got into ultras. Like every single race I lined up for, I think I just had this like grin on my face, like I'm here, like I get to be here, like yeah. I'm here, I did it. And I really try to remember that and not take it for granted, Do
you ever take yourself back to those moments, say, I don't know, mile 75 of a 100-mile race where things are kind of bleak and dire, and you'll see where I'm going with this. But do you ever allow yourself to go back to those moments where you couldn't run, obviously, and you were being fed through a tube? And I don't know if you were ever, how close you were to death, but do you draw inspiration and power from those moments?
I do. I think rather than just like, I don't have a single memory of that time being sick, but what I have is a feeling of gratitude for having come out the other side of it. And I try to focus on that. And, yeah, like there's certainly times in my 100-mile races where I'm not able to, dig in and find that, and it just sucks. But I think in general, I do try to go back to that like mantra of, you get to do this, you are here, like, and for me, it has some real meaning, and I really don't want to ever take it for granted. And it's hard because it's funny how time just like takes the edge off of those memories and experiences and makes them a little less sharp in your mind. So I do think now it's more of an exercise in remembering that, and yeah.
Well, one such instance came very recently, about a month or so ago at the High Lonesome 100, a race that we were very much looking forward to. There was going to be this build up towards it. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time gallivanting in the San Juans and Silverton, going there early so you can acclimate to high altitude. And then just one thing after another derailed our plans completely. And we'll get into some of that. But yeah, so going into it, one of the more obvious things that happened was that I got COVID. I was supposed to pace and crew for a large portion of it and also film your race. So did Sana, your friend and pacer. So you were already behind the 8 ball. And then what else happened? We picked up a dog.
Yeah, I was going to say, we got a dog. I don't know if you remember that part.
That was kind of a big deal. And that greatly limited our ability to really play in the mountains as much as we wanted to in the final crucial weeks leading up to High Lonesome. It was just a comedy of different things that happened. And then during the race, you got nauseous, you had a hard time dealing with altitude, and you couldn't put down any calories.
Yeah, it was fun. It was really fun.
A bit of a throwback to your first race when you just... Your first 50K, rather, when you couldn't consume any calories.
Where I
you
just
didn't think to.
Yeah.
So let's talk about High Lonesome 100. The comedy of different scenarios that happened, and then how you were able to rally and put together that finish.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I haven't talked to anyone about that race. Like, we kind of got through it together. You were reeling from COVID. I was reeling from what just happened. And it was just kind of like... I feel like I'm still unpacking a lot of it, but basically I signed up for High Lonesome 100 to kind of get back into the 100-mile swing of things. The last time I did one was in 2018, Cascade Crest 100, and I just kind of wanted to put myself out there again as an athlete. I think that was something that I discovered during COVID was, I missed being a runner. Yeah. And like we talked about, the balance between all the different pieces in our lives and creatively and all that.
And I want to, sorry to interrupt, but I want to establish that you're a damn good runner too. You won Fat Dog 70 miler. You podiumed at Fat Dog 120. You podiumed at Cascade Crest. So you definitely have talent in the sport, especially the long distance gets. But please continue.
That's where the stubbornness comes in. I don't think I'm the fastest runner, but I think I can just out-stubborn a lot of people. So I do. Thank you. You said that a little too quickly.
I know this is firsthand, but please continue.
But that's kind of my superpower, is the stubbornness. So I take it as a positive. But yeah, no, I do really like ultras. I feel like I have found a groove. Like, I worked with Gary for 5 years. I worked with David Roche for a year. I've just kind of been on my own since then. But I definitely have, considered myself at times to be a strong runner. I think in the last few years, my perspective towards it has shifted. It's kind of interesting when you're shooting all these races and you're really involved and you see people at that elite level who are doing this for a career. It does kind of change your perspective on it, and you realize like how much more work goes into being an elite athlete than what I am. But I do love it, and I am competitive when I'm out there. But yeah, so High Lonesome was just kind of me putting myself out there again and deciding like I want to do something that scares me. And running a 100-miler when you're from sea level and going to altitude and running it all above, 11,000 feet is really scary. So last year when we were at Hard Rock, we went to High Lonesome afterwards and got to crew for Maggie Gooderall at her race there, just kind of saw the terrain, the community, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to try it next year. So that's kind of where it came from, the backstory to High Lonesome. And like you said, we had all these wonderful plans of going to Colorado and spending time in the San Juans, and I was going to get this last amazing training block in and, go into this race just like ready to nail it. And then I watched that just like go slowly out the window.
One domino after another.
Well, I mean, we got a dog on day 2 of our road trip, which meant that you and I could no longer run together at any given time. It was just like a cascade of things happened from there. And, obviously the COVID thing was a huge wrench in our plans. The day after Hard Rock, I looked at you and I was like, uh-oh, like this is not good. And sure enough, you tested positive. My pacer, Sana, who's a good friend of mine, she texted me and she said, bad news, I got COVID from Hard Rock. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. I heard a few people did. And so both of you guys were out and, that was like most of my crew. And it's funny when you sign up for these things and you have an idea of how it's going to go. And I think I'd really set it up as this like wonderful thing. I was going to spend time with Sana, and then you and I were going to run through the night together and have this amazing time of connecting in the mountains. And so like watching that kind of disappear, I think I felt a little deflated leading up to the race.
And you were also 100% convinced that you're going to test positive because we basically share the back of my Outback.
Yeah, we were in very close quarters. There was absolutely no quarantining. We didn't even try. We looked at each other and we're like, we're going to sleep next to each other in a coffin-shaped box.
Well, we don't really have a choice.
No.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, well, I guess we'll just like see, but like odds are very good I'm going to get COVID. And so, we got all the free tests we could find. And then I just kept testing myself. And every test kept coming back negative. And I felt fine. And it was kind of trippy because you were in the full-on like COVID hazmat situation over there. And we were just like camping by ourselves near Buena Vista where the race starts, just kind of waiting for the moment where I was going to pull out of the race. And it just didn't happen. And we got to 2 days before the race and I was like, okay, well, what happens if I am running this thing, and started putting together a little bit of a plan. And a friend of mine, Jeff Allen, jumped in and volunteered to come pace and crew me. And he wasn't even supposed to be at the race, let alone, helping me out. And then my friend David was already going to be one of my pacers, but now they were kind of like on point for this whole, very long race experience.
Yeah. How do you feel like pacing a lot more?
Right. Well, and you weren't even allowed to be on the course, obviously. So it was just really challenging. And so I think I struggled a lot in the days leading up to the race, finding like my reason for doing it. Like I felt like I'd lost my motivation. And, it's interesting because you don't want to think, that's your motivation's attached to like, external factors or to like the people that you're doing it with. But for me, it did feel like I just kind of was sad that the race wasn't going to be what I'd wanted it to be. And because I kept expecting to test positive, I didn't really let myself get excited, or I wasn't in that headspace where I was like, yeah, we're going to do this thing. Right up until race morning, like I had to take, I talked to the race director, told him what was going on. And he's like, okay, well, you have to take one more test right before the race starts. And if that one is still negative, you can run. So it was only like 20 minutes before the race started that I had that final confirmation that I was going to run. And I honestly think I was expecting it to come back positive. And so I just wasn't in the mood. And then all of a sudden it was still negative and I was running around trying to like get my gear checked and fill my water. I almost forgot my poles behind. Like it was just, I felt like we were starting the race and I was like running out of the chute, still tying my shoes up,
It's
like,
the nightmare.
It's the nightmare. It's the actual
unprepared.
It's like you look down, you're in your underwear. It's that feeling of like you were so unprepared for this event or whatever. And yeah, it's every runner's worst nightmare. And I felt like the race started and that's how I felt going into it. And it was not a good start.
So that already put you behind the 8 ball. And then how did things derail so quickly, so early on?
It's a challenging course. So the thing I think I underestimated about the High Lonesome course is that it's a lot hotter than the San Juans. Being in the Sawatch Range is just like massively different terrain. You're quite exposed for a lot of it. And so the race started out with like this kind of 4-mile, like Forest Service road, meander. And then you kind of start kicking up a little bit. And then you hit the biggest climb of the day, which is like straight up to over 13,000 feet. And it was like probably over 80 degrees and you're going up this canyon and it was just like baking and it was genuinely hot. And I'm Canadian, so I don't have a high heat tolerance to begin with, but it was genuinely hot, especially compared to where we'd been. And so I think I just felt like very, very quickly, like dehydrated and all of these things that you would feel like later on in a race. But I was only like 8 miles into the race, and it just caught me off guard. And I started getting nauseous. I started getting like this blurred vision thing happening once I got around 12,000 feet. I was like weaving, like everybody in the race was passing me. And I was like, I could barely have the energy to get off the trail. Like I was like, what is going on? I literally felt like I was drugged. And then, I couldn't get any calories in. Anything I put in, just like I puked it right back out. And we're like 10 miles into a 100-miler. Like I have enough experience with these things to know that that's really bad. So it was just kind of a wild start. And I think combined with my really, like unprepared mindset going into it, I was kind of like, well, I gave it a shot. I showed up, And by the time I got to the first like crew access aid station, I had completely talked myself into quitting. I was like, well, you got a good 20 miles in, that's all you could ask for. And I got there, and Jeff and David were sitting there, and, they'd laid out all my food and everything, and you'd prepped them on what I needed and all the stuff. And they just kind of listened to me complaining and saying I was going to quit. And they're like, oh, okay, that's nice. So you're going to sit here and do this and then bye. And, bless their hearts, they just kind of patched me up. And I think, honestly, I kept going because I felt guilty that they were out there crewing for me. And, like I was wasting their time. And it was just like this funny guilt trip thing where I was like, well, I guess maybe I'll just go to the next aid station then, since they're making me keep running. And I just kind of kept going from there. But it was a weird mindset I was in, combined with not being able to keep calories in, which is usually where, you find that your mood is very affected. Like when you're bonking, you're in a terrible headspace, and so you eat. And because I wasn't able to eat or keep calories in, I just stayed in the terrible mindset. And just like constantly on a loop, I was so like in that negative place. And it was still so early on in the race, like we're like 30 miles in, and I'm in the headspace of like mile 85 in the middle of the night, So I think all of that just was very cumulative, very early for me. And I couldn't keep more than like 100 calories in, and I was just running on fumes. And it was interesting, especially because that section, it was an out and back. So I could see as I was going into the aid station, everyone that was ahead of me. And I could see when I was leaving the aid station that there weren't that many people behind me. And that also played into it, I think, and if I was honest with myself, I think there was some ego talking where I was like, this is not your day, and you're really sucking, and you're really far back here. And I'm not used to that. I've had some good races in the last few years. And so mentally, I think that threw me off as well. And so, it was just like this, like, I felt like my brain was at war with itself over what the issue really was. And I was trying to kind of problem solve it and figure out like what part of it was ego, what part of it was I didn't want to be there, what part of it was nutrition, and get to the bottom of it. And I wasn't quite ready to quit, but I was also just very frustrated and kind of in that zone very early.
So stubbornness aside, what kept you moving?
That's an excellent question. I think I asked myself the whole race, like why I was still running. I had these like repeated moments where I was like, you're still here.
If you said because of the people that you felt obligated to, that's such a Canadian thing.
And so there was a little bit of that, because when I got to the 50-mile aid station, I had walked in the last 5 miles before that because I had completely quit in my mind. I was literally like pulling my pack off as I came in, like here's my bib number, like cut it off, I'm done. And my pacer, Jeff, was standing there in all of his nighttime running gear, warming up and running back and forth. And he'd got his bib on and he'd done his gear check for me. And I just looked at him and I'm like, oh, fuck. Like, you've gone to all this trouble. You're ready to go. You're going to run through the night with me. And I'm just going to quit, So they they tried to pour some food down me. I think I kept some ginger beer in. The medical team, bless their hearts, they actually came over to me because I had terrible blisters, and they helped me fix them. And, by the time people put all that into you, you're just like, well, I should try. Like, I can at least try. And so it was just kind of that. It was, definitely a little bit of the Canadian in me that was like, just didn't want to quit and like let people down or be a bother. And then once we got out there and we were talking, and Jeff and I, it was actually beautiful. Like, you can see all the headlamps at night, and you're going over these big passes. And I did get into a place where I kind of accepted like what my day was. And I was no longer like at war with myself about how slow I was or how much behind my times I was, or I just kind of let all of that go. And I was like, well, you're just here. You're just going to keep moving, and that's all you can do. And I do feel like that's kind of where it shifted a little bit, where I didn't come to peace with it, but I just came to like a truce, I would say, like I was okay with where I was, and I just had to, it was kind of vulnerable. Like, honestly, I felt like very exposed for just like, this is me on this day. And like, it's not the race I normally have. I'm not having any of these like incredible highs or anything. I'm just having all the lows, but also like, that's okay. Like, I can just be here. And I did think a lot about people that I admire in the sport. And, I often admire people that just finish things, even when it's hard. And I was at Western States this year and watching someone like Tim Tollefson or Brittany Peterson come in and, not have the races that they wanted to. And they're hours later than they'd, previously run the race. And yet they're still out there finishing. And last year I paced Mike Wardian at Hard Rock. And that was another example of someone that just didn't quit. Like, Mike had a terrible race and had altitude sickness, and I paced him for the last 20 miles, and he ended up just like pushing through, and he had a great last 20 miles. And I really admired that ability to just keep going, even when it's not your day. And, I just think there's something to that idea of just not quitting. And it's hard. Like, I actually think quitting's way easier. And that definitely felt like the cop-out. Like, I could just quit, and then nobody would know how terrible my race was, and it'll just all be over. But, it just got to the point where like the only purpose to me moving forward was not quitting. And that was enough. And it was like interesting to distill the ultra running experience to something so basic. Like, normally you have all these A goals and B goals and whatever to keep you going. But my only goal was just don't quit. And that became my mantra for the last like 30 miles of the race, was just one foot in front of the other. And honestly, for a while, we did the math on how long it was going to take me to get to the finish line. And I started worrying about cutoffs, which I've never done in my life before. And I started doing the math on how long I'd have to, or how much time I had and how many miles I had to run per hour. And, like, I had no buffer. Like, I had to keep running every chance I got. Like, every aid station I was worrying about the cutoffs. At one point I thought I might be like DFL. And I had to just kind of come to terms with it all. And, I have a lot of respect for people that are out there fighting cutoffs. And I have even more respect for it now that I was in that position, because it sucks. And it's hard enough to run 100 miles, let alone to run 100 miles with this feeling of doom hanging over you. And you're worried about taking 5 extra seconds at the aid station because you might get cut off. That's terrible. And so I think in some ways, maybe it was the experience that I needed and or deserved, just like to realize at the end of the day, like, really none of the times matter. Like, who are we kidding? It's all arbitrary. Like, somebody wins and it's incredible. But for most of us, it's just about finishing and doing our best on that day. And for me, on that day, I did my best. And I do truly feel that I did. And that was what it looked like. And that was a humbling experience for me.
Well, it's going to be interesting seeing you put together the film of your experience, because you're going to have to relive that all over again. But as it stands right now, with a few weeks in your rear view, how are we feeling about your finish? Are we feeling proud? Are you like, well, I got it done, and it's very matter of fact in that way? How are you looking at your high lonesome finish and just persevering?
I mean, I think it's a different sort of pride. It's not a pride in like, yeah, I did great and I've got all these accolades and people think I'm fast. It's like, I just didn't quit, and people probably don't even realize how hard that was, like, not to quit. And so I think I do carry some satisfaction in that. And it's kind of funny thinking about the video, because I probably told the GoPro about 10 times that I was done. That's it, I quit. So I have to decide how many of those to keep in there. There's a lot of false alarms. But yeah, I am proud of it. I think it's a different sort of accomplishment to finish something that's just really hard from start to finish. But I also think that a lot of the reason that we go into these races is because that suffering is the appeal, and I do really appreciate that. And especially with my background and things I've been through in life, there's a lot of value in that suffering, and you do feel very alive in those moments. And so I felt very alive for 34 hours and 55 minutes. I felt very alive. So there's something to that.
Well, on to hopefully more pleasant topics of, and I was debating whether or not to even go here, but hell, why not? You want to go into how we met and how this whole partnership started?
All right, we can go there. So we met in 2019 through my friend Sana. Billy had organized an Earth Day cleanup run in Griffith Park, and Sana lived nearby in LA, and I happened to be visiting her. And so we showed up at the run, and I was like, oh, who's this guy? He's kind of cute. No, I think it was more just like interesting. I honestly hadn't really wasn't that familiar with you being from Canada and stuff. And we connected and we started chatting. And again, it was like that whole feeling of being in the same creative industry together. I really kind of looked at some of your work after. I really admired a lot of what you do. I listened to some of your podcasts. I was just like, he's an interesting guy. And so we kind of stayed in touch just through, the world ending, COVID and all that stuff. There's sort of like a misconnection where you were supposed to come up to Vancouver for a visit in 2020. You were going to run Chuckanut.
After Chuckanut, in March of 2020.
Yeah, and so, you'd reached out. You're like, oh, I'll be up in Vancouver. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's cool. We'll get to connect again. You just kind of have these bookmarks you put in your mind sometimes when you meet someone, but your lives are also whirling dervishes. And so, obviously that didn't happen because the world ended. But then last year, I actually went down to Hard Rock to visit my friend Sana, who'd moved to Colorado, and just as a chance to get away from everything and the chaos of the last few years and be in the ultrarunning community again. And you happened to be there as well. And you were doing the same thing, which is kind of funny. You were also just seeking out that community and missing that connection. Yeah, no real plans. I think the world had just, or at least here nationally, had just started to open back up. I remember with Western states, everyone was kind of on edge, or will this happen? Won't it happen? And then the numbers went down, and Western states happened, and then Hard Rock was next. So it was definitely, the community component of it was a huge motivating factor, because I wasn't there necessarily for a gig. I was looking for work to kind of validate the trip after the fact, once I arrived. But I was mainly going for the loss of community for the year and a half prior to that. So we found community. Yeah, sure. We did. Yeah, it was funny. And I mean, I'd never been to Hard Rock, so I was just excited to be there. I actually did the graphic design for the Finisher Awards and posters and stuff last year. So it was just kind of one of those things. It was very serendipitous. I was like, oh, I'll just go to Hard Rock and that'll be cool. And we both just, I think, ended up meeting in the right place at the right time and the right stage of our lives. And I think that that's so interesting, just how much of life is literally timing. And for us, kind of connecting there, we were looking for the same thing, and you're in these beautiful mountains camping, and it's just very honest and very, very kind of real. And so, we found each other again. Yeah. It started off with you, me, I think Sana was there, and then she left early, and then it ended up being Jeff Allen, Zach Miller, the four of us traveling through Colorado together, dirtbagging it. And I don't know if our relationship could start at a point where we're both unshowered and sleeping in the back of cars and tents in the middle of the San Juans. I think it's just all uphill from there. Totally, I know. I almost didn't recognize you when you showered. I know, it was pretty special. And I remember at one point you looked at me and you're like, do you want to change your flight home and drive to LA with me instead and go on a road trip? And we kind of just went for it. And I think if nothing else, COVID made us all appreciate that you do have to just seize opportunities, and, we were just craving them. So a lot of me was just carpe diem, and on the road we went. And well, one of the ways in which I feel like we really connect is that we both try to keep our eyes on the North Star, that is life and death. And we fully, through our own personal journeys, we know viscerally that tomorrow is not promised to any one of us. And we try to live accordingly, not recklessly, but just live accordingly, and just keep that North Star very prominently placed in our windshield, I guess. Yeah. I mean, that was honestly one of the things that first drew me to you, was once I started learning your story and listening to your podcast, and just the way that you see the world, and the questions you ask, and what you're looking for from life. And you don't find that everywhere, and it is special. And having learned that myself, it's something that is really important to me, is like, I want to eke the most out of life that I possibly can. And, I think you have that same drive in you. And it's been, obviously amazing to combine that force and kind of do it together, but also very like easy in many ways, because we were both already doing the same thing and looking for the same thing in life. And we just kind of took those two paths and moved them a little bit more parallel together,
And now we're dog parents.
How did that happen?
Well, we can tell the quick version of it this year with all these lofty ideas, as we mentioned, with plans to play in the San Juans and train for your race and run your race together as part of a team. All that got derailed, but it started on day 2 by finding the stray on the highway after we camped.
Yep. So we're like driving out of this very remote kind of deserted area in Arizona. We were doing some dispersed camping, and we saw this like little, I thought it was a fox. I don't know what you thought it was, but like these little animals crossing the road, and we pulled over, and it was this like puppy and another dog with him, and they came over to us, and the other dog was super shy and quite wild, but this puppy came right up to us, and like his whole body was wriggling, and he was like so excited to see us, and also like very dehydrated and clearly starving and covered in ticks. And yeah, it's just like he stole our hearts right from the get-go. And, we were not planning on adopting a dog. We even tried to leave at one point, and he chased the car down the road. And I think that's when I knew that I was a total goner. But yeah, the short story is that we ended up with the dog in the car driving to Colorado. We were trying to find a shelter, and then we were trying to find a vet, and nobody would take him. And so we ended up
apparently everyone and their daughters and their mothers got a dog during COVID. Yeah, that was one of the byproducts of everyone being locked in, was that, now's the time to get a dog. And
so the vets were super busy. They just kind of laughed at us when we tried calling and getting an appointment. And, one vet just kind of suggested like, well, go to the pet shop and give him a flea and tick bath, and, we'll get you in a couple weeks, but good luck. And so neither one of us had the heart to just abandon him at a shelter. So Charlie Salami came with us on our road trip, and, we drove to Silverton the next day. So he was immediately an ultra running dog, just kind of thrown into the race and ultra world and camping with us. I think he thought that camping was normal for like a month,
Yeah.
That was his whole life experience in an urban setting. But yeah, obviously it's been a lot of work having little Charlie, but I don't think either of us would trade it. He's the freaking cutest and most annoying part of our lives, and it's been a ride.
Yeah, having a puppy is not recommended if you're somebody who loves traveling and is living a very inconsistent, at least from a schedule and where you are, lifestyle, because there's been so much that he's had to deal with. But my God, he's been a champ.
But, I also have to say, and I think we can both agree, that sometimes in life the timing doesn't perfectly line up. And both of us have wanted a dog for a long time. And I've always just said, like, I'm too busy. I can't do it. It's not fair, blah, blah, blah. But when it happens, we've made it work. And we have fit our lives around it and fit him in. And there's something to be said for things not lining up exactly right and still just going for it. So maybe that's the lesson in all of this for us,
Yeah. And in our case, it did line up, and now we have a life and adventure
puppy.
Before we say goodbye, as we wind things down, I want you to offer up some parting words of advice, especially to if you're an aspiring female creative out there listening to this. What would be some of your advice, whether it's from getting started to maintaining a career? I know we're both still trying to figure things out as creatives, but what would be your initial bit of advice?
The first is just, if you're passionate about it, it takes work to do it, and don't be afraid to put that work in and to put yourself out there and to reach out. And I actually think one of the strengths of female photographers is that we do look for that community and that network. I've worked with a lot of guys in the past who are very solo and very just like lone wolf style. But I feel like the more women I've reached out to and connected with, the more that they're also looking to build more of a community and to have that support system. And so I think reach out to other like female creatives who you're inspired by or you admire, and see if you can come shadow them at a race. reach out to a race director and see if you can just show up and shoot the event and work out some sort of a deal. I did a lot of that when I was starting out, just to put myself out there. And I think if people see that you have a passion for what you do and you're willing to work hard, they'll give you a chance. And it's been really cool seeing more women getting into this. And I do think we have a really unique voice as storytellers. I think we see things differently. I think there's the opportunity there to help inspire people, anyone really, to get into running ultras just by the nature of the stories we're telling and like that perspective. And so, I think it's just putting yourself out there and going for it. And, honestly, like I look back at some of my early photos and they're terrible, or at least to me. Like I cringe, I see the edits on them and I go, oh, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I put that out there. And you probably have the same feeling when you see some of your earlier videos. It's just human nature and it's part of evolving as a creative. And like, I hope that I always feel that way because it means that I'm getting better,
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? So it's just part of the process. But it's also, I think, important to just go for it. And similar to like what I've been saying in other aspects of life, like it doesn't all have to be perfect or line up perfectly in order to just kind of jump and figure it out. And I think you do, and so that's been my biggest lesson is like, if I'm willing to commit and to go for it and to really give it my all, that doors open and people see that and they respect that because they know it's scary, and you'll be surprised like who will give you a chance.
As you say in I think it's in your Instagram handle, your little tagline of the process being the purpose.
It's actually the process is the purpose.
We say process here. I'm sorry. The process is the purpose. And I think within that process is a whole lot of failing. It's a whole lot of the world laughing at your expectations and your best intentions.
Expectation versus reality,
Exactly. Yeah. So I think the more you embrace that, the more life will start to serve you.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think that's the best motto that I could come up with for my entire life, not just my professional life, but my ultra running and everything. It's like, if you can't appreciate the journey and what it takes to get there, and all you're focused on is getting there or making it or being successful or having that name or whatever it is, like, it's not worth it. It's never going to be worth it because you're never going to get to that end goal. In the same way that you mentioned a few minutes ago that like, where we are in our careers, whatever that looks like you still don't feel like you've made it. I still don't feel like I've made it. Like we never will, like, because that benchmark's always moving. So I think you have to just settle in and appreciate like, this is where I am, and show up there. And that's the starting point. And I think it's something that a lot of creatives struggle with because we're our own worst critics. And especially when we don't have a lot of other feedback, it's really easy to get stuck in that feeling of being inadequate or having imposter syndrome. I think it's something a lot of women struggle with, something I've seen shooting with a lot of guys is that often they're way more confident putting out work that I don't think is as good than I am putting out work that I feel good about, just because of that feeling of like,
it's societal too.
Yeah,
right?
Totally. Yeah. It all plays into it. And so I think as women, a lot of what we can do is help support each other and provide that encouragement and that feedback, whether it's, hard truth or whether it's positive feedback. It's, just kind of encourage each other to get into it and to go for it. And that applies to, people running the ultras and people shooting them, all of it, right? Like, it's just, I think the more that we just accept where we're at and don't feel like we have to somehow be at some level in order to enter into the game, that's the biggest thing that stops people often.
On a final note, I'm going to ask you to zoom back again and in talking about life philosophy, the role of gratitude, how it comes into your life and how it plays out in your life. What do you think about when I ask you about gratitude?
I think about all the people that have given me chances, or been kind to me, or in some way shown me something unexpected in life. And I think that it instills in me that desire to do the same. And that's why I enjoy mentoring other female photographers, and why I feel like I want to give back in that way is I have a lot of gratitude for the people that have seen me and where I am and decided to give me that opportunity to crash and burn or to succeed or whatever it might be. But, I think that in life, we're only going to be stronger for, enabling other people around us. And I think having that attitude, when you do things for other people, you feel good about it too. So it all is kind of this like feedback loop. But I come back to a place of gratitude for what others have given me or the chances they've taken on me. And then I try to pay that forward.
Well, in line with gratitude, I'm immensely grateful for you and in how, I guess, patient you are.
Way to show me up.
And being my life and adventure partner. Hilary Matheson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm glad we finally got to do this.
Thanks, babe.